Welcome to Season 2 of Ed Falco on the Air. In this episode, I'll be reading Dooley's Guild and Tavern, a short story by Steve Gibson. Gibson, primarily known as a poet, is the author of 8 award-winning poetry collections. But he also writes short stories, and this one, originally published in 5 Points and then reprinted in High Five, an anthology of short stories from 10 years of 5 Points, is one of my favorites. It's a tale that takes you back to a period in our country's history soon after the end of World War II, to a neighborhood bar where the floors are sticky, the air is thick with smoke, and the past lingers just beneath the surface of every conversation. In Dooley's Guild and Tavern, we see that world through the eyes of a boy who is intensely observant and trying to make sense of the adults around him. At first, Dooley's Tavern is a place of small pleasures. Coca-Colas lined up on the bar, pinball games, men who tell stories, and women who seem glamorous and mysterious. But as the memories unfold, the story shifts into a tale about anger, loyalty, and the complicated ways love and conflict live side by side in a family. And it's about, especially at the end, something the narrator couldn't understand then as a child. But we guess he does now, in retrospect, as does the reader. Dooley's Guild and Tavern was missing an R, but it had loud talk, loud music, beer and whiskey smells, the Clancy brothers on the jukebox, and Mel Allen on the TV over the bar giving the afternoon Yankees starting lineup. I was 9. I sat on a red plastic-covered stool that swiveled whenever I got down to go to the bathroom, watching for my glass of Coke on the bar, with my dollar bill next to it as soon as I came out. The dollar bill was my stepfather's, Harry Kaiser's. A dollar bill for all the Cokes I could drink, all the pretzels and peanuts in the bowls I could eat, and all the ham salad or tuna salad white bread sandwiches that were cut into triangles and had the crusts cut off. Quarters weighed down both front pockets of my dungarees for the bowling pinball machine. I was tops at pinball bowling. I racked up nearly perfect games every Saturday. Men would drift over from the bar on their way to the bathroom and rub my head. They rubbed my head for good luck. They also rubbed my head because I was tops at picking out who would be the next Miss Rongold. Whether anyone was looking or not, I would go by myself to the corner booth in the back past the bathrooms and the jukebox and fill in all the ballot slips from the pads. I stuffed the ballot box with my favorites. The next Miss Rongold always had to have a round face and dark hair, just like my mother's. Then I returned the ballot box to the side of the cash register that was never used, the one sitting against the wall at the end of the bar under the crossed Irish and American flags where the big mirror and the duckboard ended. I liked walking along duckboard. When Dooley's wasn't too busy in the morning, Dooley would tie an apron at the back of my neck and around my waist and put 2 glasses running over with foam into my hands to take to someone at the bar. I made a game of getting the glasses over to the cork coasters on the bar without spilling any, and before any of the foam dripped off the bottoms of the glasses. The tip that went into the tip jar would be mine. In the afternoon, Dooley's was thick with men and women and overflowing ashtrays. My unofficial job was to go around the bar, step up onto the footrail between the stools, and empty the ashtrays without anyone noticing. I carried a metal mop bucket which had water in the bottom of it and tape on the outside that said, 4 butts. I liked stepping up on the rail next to the women and quickly dumping their ashtrays. I liked the smudges of lipstick on their teeth, the way they turned their heads up when they laughed, the way they flicked their ashes into the ashtrays without even looking or knowing I'd gotten their ashtray back under their cigarette without them noticing. I liked being next to the women, the way they sat sideways on the stool with their legs crossed over each other, the way the smell of perfume and beer and cigarettes all mixed together on them, the way they sometimes didn't know an extra button on their blouses had opened. The men they talked to and who bought them shots were men who had been through the war against Germany and Japan, just like my father. When they weren't in Dooley's, they drove bread trucks and were mailmen and hot typesetters for newspapers, and cabbies who always parked in front of Dooley's so they could watch them through the window, so that nobody tried to pry off a medallion with a screwdriver. The men wore white short-sleeved shirts and black or brown pants and white socks and black or brown shoes, and they had pale, white, skinny, and hairless forearms, or thick, meaty, hairy forearms that had tattoos on the insides and outsides of them. Sometimes the tattoos under the dark hair were pictures of the face of Jesus looking up to heaven with the crown of thorns pressed into his head and little droplets of blood hanging off the tip of each thorn just before the drops were about to go into Jesus' eyes. Usually, the men had more than just one tattoo on their arms. Red hearts with banners flowing across them with a girl's name like Rose or Catherine or Peggy written across the banner that scrolled up on either end. Sometimes there would be Mom written across the banner in the place of a girl's name. Tim Murphy, who drove a daily news truck and who was also in the union, had a naked hula girl in a grass skirt that wiggled on the outside of his left forearm when he moved his fist up and down. The Daily News did a story about Tim. He was on the Hornet when the Hornet was sunk. It was only the first time, or maybe the second time, when the Japanese sent kamikazes into our ships. But Tim got his job driving the truck because he knew someone in the Union. The story about him watching the rest of the battle while he was in the ocean, that only came later, after he got the job. But most of the time, the men didn't talk about the war. If someone who wasn't a regular did, you could count on the guy on the next stool getting up, digging into the front pocket of his pants, pulling out his money clip, and leaving more than enough next to his glass to cover the tab. Most of the men kept their money folded in half with a silver or gold clip in the front pocket of their pants. When they took their money out, they laid the bills neatly next to their glasses or under the ashtray when they got up and left. The regulars I listened to didn't talk about the war. Sometimes they got loud, but that was always because of the booze, not because of the war. Not like the ones who weren't regulars at Dooley's, the ones who sometimes stopped in and then you never saw again. The men talked loudly because of the booze and because they couldn't be heard above the jukebox or the television, but they always knew what they were talking about Whitey Ford being taken out of the starting rotation because of his elbow, the left one, the only one that counted, or why no one would ever pitch a perfect game in the series again, or why Ingmar Johansson's foot kept twitching on the canvas at the stadium after Patterson caught him with that left hook. His foot kept twitching like that because there were nerves that still stay alive for a few seconds in your body, not only after you've been knocked unconscious, but even after you've just been killed, because some of those nerves don't know yet that you're already dead. Dennis O'Toole didn't fight in the war, but that's all he ever talked about, just like he was there. He got drunk so he could talk about it and anything else. O'Toole got drunk just so he could talk, and he was a filthy liar. Those were my mother's words. Even when I was really little, before Patrick was born and Michael was still a baby, all I remembered was that whenever my father would sign himself back into the hospital, O'Toole would always be upstairs in our apartment. He lived with his older sister, Margaret, who also wasn't married. They owned the corner candy store in our building. I would be in the bathroom in the tub, and my mom would be washing Michael in the kitchen sink, and then I would hear someone talking to her. And by the time I came out in my pajamas, there would be O'Toole in our kitchen. The tea kettle would be on the stove, not yet whistling, and there would be 2 cups cups and saucers and 2 plates with forks and napkins next to the plates, and there would be a box of Drake's coffee cakes sitting in the center of the kitchen table. I would be sitting on the couch in the living room, and I would watch O'Toole sitting there in the good chair by the kitchen window, the chair that didn't have any gray tape on the seat and back like the 2 others. He'd be talking to my mom while she was washing Michael in the sink. O'Toole would put his foot on the side of the stove and smoke a cigarette, waiting for the tea kettle to whistle. Then he'd pour the boiling water over the tea bags while my mom wrapped Michael in a towel and carried him into the bedroom to go to bed. There was one bedroom. The big bed was for my mom and dad when he wasn't in the hospital. Michael and I shared the fold-up cot. When Michael was a baby, he slept in the bottom drawer of the big dresser. The drawer was filled with towels instead of my dad's pants and shirts. Then when Patrick was born, he got the bottom dresser drawer. When my father didn't come back from the hospital, Michael and Patrick and I slept in the big bed, and my mom slept on the cot. I hated Dennis O'Toole. He thought he was a big shot just because he could light the pilot light under the stove when it went out with only the first match. He thought he was so smart. I didn't want to see him try standing an egg on one end on our kitchen table. I didn't want him in our apartment. So he broke the egg on the bottom, so what? It was a broken egg that my mom had to wipe with a dishcloth into the garbage. He was a sneaky, skinny man with red hair that stood straight up on his head like wires. He had a pale face with red freckles all over it, and he wore thick, black-rimmed glasses that were as thick as the bottom of Coca-Cola bottles. The thickness of the glasses made O'Toole's eyes look like 2 tiny cat's eye marbles behind them. When I walked into the kitchen, I would always look at those cat's eyes behind those glasses, and my eyes would go to the pocket of his white short-sleeved shirt where his black eyeglass case stuck out, then to the silver pocket watch chain hooked to a belt loop on his black pants, then down to his pants pocket. I had the feeling that he had stolen something from our kitchen. After the first 10 seconds, O'Toole wouldn't look at me. He'd pull out his pocket watch, snap the case open by pressing his thumb, look at the time, then shut it and return it to his pocket. He'd look up at the clock over our stove, or up at the ceiling above his head, or turn around at the table and begin dunking his tea bag up and down in his cup, or else maybe open the lid of the box and begin picking at the top of the cake. If I stared at him too long, he sometimes got angry and would suddenly jump, telling me, "Didn't your mother teach you it's impolite to stare at people?" And he'd go into the living room and plop down on our couch. He'd sit there in the dark with both arms stretched over the tops of the cushions, waiting for my mother to come out and waiting for me to go to bed. O'Toole was always in our apartment. The last time when my father was home, it was a couple of months after Patrick was born. I tried to tell him about Dennis O'Toole always coming up. I wanted to tell him about O'Toole being in our apartment almost every night to have tea, and the box of Drake's coffee cake that he would always bring with him, and the Hershey bars I found in the refrigerator in the morning next to the newly opened container of milk. I hated those Hershey bars. I would never eat them, even though my mom said they were left for me. One time, I threw them in the garbage right in front of her. I told her O'Toole shouldn't be coming up to the house every night. "Dennis just keeps me company while your father's away," she said. I hollered at her that he shouldn't be keeping her company. He shouldn't be bringing up Drake's coffee cups or containers of milk or Hershey bars, and she shouldn't let him press up against her when she was washing Michael in the sink. On that occasion, my mother had asked O'Toole to get down the cups and saucers from the cabinet overhead because her hands were soapy. My mother smacked me when I said that. So every time my father came home, I wanted to tell him about Dennis O'Toole. When my mom said I was too old to go to the hospital with her, I would look out the front window, waiting for the taxicab to pull up, and my father would get out with Michael in his arms, and then my mother, and the cabbie would take the single brown suitcase out of the trunk, and I would hold open the door as I waited on the landing, listening to them come up the stairs. Then when Michael was too old, the both of us watched for the taxi cab. The last time he came home, I didn't know it was to be the last time. I made up my mind to tell him about Dennis O'Toole. Patrick was only a couple of months old, but I couldn't tell him. My father had taken the steamer trunk out of the bedroom closet, and he had spread out all of his war souvenirs on the bed. There was a gun and a bayonet and a big German flag that he had spread out on the big bed and laid the gun and bayonet on top of it. And the same pictures were spread out everywhere. Pictures my mother stuffed back into their envelopes and put back into the steamer trunk, along with the German flag and the bayonet and the gun and the letters that she tied into bundles with rubber bands and put back into the trunk and put the trunk back into the closet the day after she took my dad back to the hospital in the taxi cab. They were pictures of my dad smiling, relaxed, with his hands behind his back in his army uniform, squinting into the sun. Pictures of him and my mom on the stoop of our building, my mom standing on the second bottom step, my dad on the bottom one. Pictures of them at the Bronx Zoo, my mom turning away, making a face, her hand behind her as a llama's head leans down over the fence. Pictures of both of them leaning together against the front fender of a black car, my dad's left arm over her shoulder, my mom with her dark hair worn up above her forehead, two big scrolls of shining dark hair with a flower between. It's an antique, a 2x3 black and white one with serrated edges that faded to oatmeal. It's the one photo of them I keep in my wallet, behind the picture of Kristen getting her degree from Tulane and Andrew's high school graduation. My dad's got style. The end of his tie is tucked between the third and fourth button of his uniform, and his hat is folded through the epaulette on his right shoulder. My mom's wearing a polka dot dress and is laughing. She's leaning down with her arm because the wind is blowing up the bottom of her dress as the picture's being shot. And letters, piles and piles of letters scattered all over the German flag. It was the middle of the summer, but the bedroom was dark. My mom was crying. She told me to take Michael and Patrick across the street to Aunt Helen's. When I ran back upstairs, my mom was sitting on the steps in the stairwell in the hallway. She was blowing her nose into her hanky and looking up at the big New York City cop who was standing over her, talking quietly to her with one of his hands on her shoulder. The cop turned around to tell Mrs. Mallory across the hall, who opened her door to shut it. "Mind your own goddamn business," he said when she tried to come out. I ran inside before the cop or my mom could stop me. There was a big cop in our kitchen, standing there, leaning with his arm out against the door frame like he was holding the wall up, looking into our bedroom. I pushed between him and the door. My dad was standing there in his boxer shorts and undershirt by the cot. All of the pictures and letters and pistol and the bayonet and the German flag were all over the big bed. My dad had his head down. He had his arms over the shoulders of the two other big New York City cops. They were helping him get his pants on. The big black cop was saying over and over, "It's all right, Frank," as my dad's other foot tried to find the other opening. My dad looked up at me as he got the leg into the pants. I don't think he knew I was. Like I said, I hated Dennis O'Toole. Until the day Harry Kaiser married my mom, I used to go into O'Toole's candy store and steal. Candy, gum, packs of balloons, balsa wood airplanes, cheap metal cap guns, boxes of rolled caps, boxes of plastic model tanks and ships and airplanes, even a big box with an aircraft carrier in it, the tubes of modeling glue, the safety pins you use to poke holes in the tubes, quarters, nickels, dimes, dollar bills from the cigar box outside on top of the newspapers on the paper stand in front of the store. It didn't matter what, just so I could get my hands on something and then later throw it down the sewer. And when Michael was old enough, I taught him how to steal with me. I let Michael keep the caps because he liked to unroll them on the sidewalk and make them snap with the soles of his shoes. and gum. I let Michael chew the packs of gum I snuck into my pocket, but then give it back to me when he finished, so that I could leave his and mine in front of the newspaper stand, or inside the newspapers, or on the street, or inside the entrance of the candy store, and sometimes even on the seats and the edges of the counter where people who sat down would lean on the gum with their arms or their elbows. Whenever O'Toole and Margaret weren't paying attention that I'd come into the store, I did whatever I could get away with, taking whatever opportunity presented me with. If it was only a pack of gum, then I wanted people who went into the candy store to get gum on their shoes and on their pants and on their dresses and on their elbows when they sat down at the counter. And if O'Toole or Margaret looked up and saw me, then I'd go outside and wait and sneak gum inside the newspapers or take whatever I could grab from the cigar box. But never all of it. Never too much of anything at one time. I wanted him and Margaret to know money was missing from the cigar box or model airplane box had suddenly disappeared from the front window or gum had again gotten on the seat, but I didn't want them to know for sure that it was me. Michael was too little to understand. He didn't understand why O'Toole's sister Margaret always shouted for us to get out whenever she saw us come in, or why O'Toole and his sister always got into arguments when she did, Margaret always shouting, and O'Toole shouting back at her, "Customers are not in the store," about him and that shanty Irish whore who thinks she's lace, or her shanty children, and that good-for-nothing husband who can't even say his own name anymore. I didn't care. It didn't bother me. In fact, O'Toole's sister shouting at me to get out didn't embarrass me at all. It only made me happy. Because when she would start shouting at him, and they would begin shouting at each other and would still be shouting even when the customers started walking out, I was glad. Michael was too young to understand. Like he was too young to understand why we always ran around the block to the empty lot in the alley behind the buildings, or why I would tear open the boxes and snap apart the plastic models and stomp on the tubes of glue until they splattered all over the broken cinder blocks, or when I took stick matches from on top of the stove, why I would set the boxes with the model airplanes in them on fire, or destroyers, or aircraft carriers, or P-51 Mustangs, just like I set the balsa wood airplanes on fire. And if O'Toole and Margaret's candy store wasn't in our building, but was in the building next to the lot, I would have set the building and their candy store on fire by starting a fire in the mattresses, by piling the tires and the newspapers and the old chairs against the building, hoping the bricks would collapse into their store from the flames. Instead, I opened the candy bars and the snack cakes and threw them down into the sewer, and burned plastic models and balsa wood gliders instead of burning Dennis O'Toole and his sister Margaret. Michael was too little to understand, so I always let him have one candy bar or a package of balloons, or the rolls of red paper caps, so he could scrape them with his shoes on the sidewalk because the caps made him happy, making loud noises, and he liked the black smudges and the burn marks the caps left on the sidewalk. O'Toole had been sneaky and mean by always coming up to the house to smoke and to have tea and eat Drake's coffee cakes, waiting until after my brother and me were in bed. So I was being sneaky and mean to him for being mean to my father. In Dooley's, if O'Toole just sat at the other end of the bar and didn't make a peep, everything was all right. Everyone watched the ball game. The men talked to the women and bought shots for them. I played pinball bowling and filled in the Miss Rheingold slips and leaned to tilt the glasses under the tap and then carried them over to the bar and then later walked back to the apartment with my arm across the back of my stepfather's, Harry Kaiser's, gray suit jacket as he walked crookedly on the sidewalk like he was going to topple over but never did. My stepfather, Harry Kaiser, winter or summer, always wore a gray suit and a white shirt open at the neck, no tie, a gray fedora to cover his bald head, and always the same black pair of high-top shoes with white socks, the left shoe with the metal toe in it and metal through the sides because of the polio. In all those years before I stopped going to Dooley's with him, Harry Kaiser never once said one word to Dennis O'Toole, not even on those times when O'Toole got big and brave after he had too much to drink and would shout at the bar so Harry could hear it that Harry Kaiser was a fool for buying the cow when the milk was free. Not even when the other men would tell O'Toole to shut up and pull him off his stool and throw him out the door. When Dooley himself, more than once, would take the baseball bat out from behind the bar, Harry Kaiser never said anything. And it wasn't because Harry was afraid of Dennis O'Toole, because he wasn't. But I didn't understand. How could a woman, almost right after her husband died in some hospital way down in Florida, marry a 61-year-old man like Harry Kaiser, who never fought in the war, who was partially crippled from polio, who took me to Dooley's, who filled my pockets with quarters, who drank too much on Saturday, never on Sunday, and got up every morning to go to work? How? And how could he have married a woman with 3 kids who were someone else's? I didn't understand. I was a kid. That was Dooley's Gill and Tavern by Steve Gibson. The name of the bar, of course, is Dooley's Grill and Tavern, but perfectly appropriate to the place and the atmosphere of the story. That R in the tavern sign got busted out at some prior time and never replaced. That's one of the many vivid details in this story that I especially enjoy, as I do the subtle manner in which the author reveals the complicated trauma of men returning from war and how it affects a family and the way people cope, both children and adults. If you have a comment on this or any story I've read in this podcast, you can contact me at falco.ed@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and please come back next week when I'll read Alison Haigie's story, Semper Paratus, from her collection Graveyard of the Atlantic, published by Grey Wolf Press. Till then, be well and take good care.